Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline San Francisco, April 18th, 1906. In a moment, the story.
At 5:12 a.m. on Wednesday, April 18th, 1906, near San Francisco, an estimated 8 Richter scale earthquake hit that area. The events that followed resulted in one of the worst natural disasters in the United States history. The earthquake happened along the northern part of the San Andreas Fault and ruptured around 270 miles of the San Andreas Fault. The earthquake produced land displacements as high as 20 feet in some areas. The people in America up to that point had been unaware of the power of earthquakes, which is why the 1906 earthquake hurt San Francisco so much. The earthquake upon impact inflicted a lot of damage to the city. The actual earthquake only lasted around 40 seconds. The damage the actual shaking caused was substantial. For example, the actual shaking completely destroyed the town hall. After the earthquake finished, the real chaos started. Some people immediately started fleeing the city. Others started looting whatever they could.
The city of San Francisco was rocked by an earthquake of frightening proportions. Building after building went crashing to the ground as the first tremor lasted a nightmarish 2 minutes. Walls of the city's masonry buildings collapsed, tumbling their occupants to death and injury. Hundreds were crushed, suffocated, and trapped as floors and roofs fell through to cellars. Buildings not leveled outright rocked crazily, while frightened San Franciscans fled outdoors in dread anticipation.
Fires started happening right after the earthquake, which would cause most of the damage to the city. Unfortunately, one of the first casualties of the disaster was Fire Chief Sullivan, when he was mortally wounded after a chimney fell onto the firehouse. Right away, the fire department was doomed to fight the multiple fires that would start. Not only had they practically lost their only leader, but water, sewer, and gas lines had all broken during the earthquake.
And then the panic was increased by the sickening horror of fire. Hundreds of structures fell before the fiery blast of the holocaust that swept through the ruins of the once thriving metropolis. Some 16 separate fires now ring San Francisco. As firemen rushed to the rescue, they faced a new disaster. Succeeding earth tremors had burst the city's water mains. They had only a trickle of moisture to pour on the blazing inferno. Panic gripped the city.
However, San Francisco had decent-sized Navy and Army bases, so both assembled to help fight the fire. The Navy forces there were 3 ships, and yet they saved many lives and fought the fire that occurred on the waterfront with ocean water. They were the few heroes of the disaster. The Army started evacuating the city where it could and also tried to fight the fires. One main attempt to stop the fire was doing fire breaks. Fire breaks are essentially to use TNT to destroy buildings and halt the fire from spreading, but the fire breaks usually just doomed more of the city to destruction and more fire. Eventually the fires combined into 3 huge infernos. Fire temperatures sometimes reached 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. The fires were so big that they fed themselves until they finally burned themselves out. 4 days later, on Saturday, at least 4 square miles were destroyed by the fire. Although at the time they didn't know it, 3,000 to 4,000 people had died. There were $500 million in property damage, and 250,000 people were left homeless.
Finally, it was over. Dynamited buildings on Van Ness Avenue stopped the fire. San Francisco was left to mourn its dead and its destruction. The citizens wandered in a daze among the smoldering rubble of their once proud city. 4 square miles of the California town had been reduced to charred ruins. Damage was estimated in excess of $500 million. Over 28,000 buildings were leveled, a frightening toll of death and destruction caused by the most tragic earthquake to ever strike the North American continent.
But what do we learn from this disaster? First, we learn that TNT does not help without fires. Second, scientists during that time period learned a lot about earthquakes. Up to that point, there are a few huge earthquakes that have been documented. But for this earthquake, there are pictures and even some video taken. And those types of documenting had not existed to document earthquakes before. This also gave a lot of insight into how deadly an earthquake could be. The disaster was also the first sign of the San Andreas fault line. There have been many earthquakes since the disaster in 1906. The earthquake in 1906 helped produce predictions for future San Francisco earthquakes. So what is in San Francisco's future? The San Andreas fault line should not have another 1906 type earthquake until around 2100. But the Hayward fault line, which is near San Francisco also, is at risk of an earthquake. Scientists predict that San Francisco should face another major earthquake in the next 30 or so years.